Assalamu alaikum, brothers, sisters, and friends. Welcome to a new episode of the GDM Show, the Global Dawah Movement Show. On this week's show, we're going to be discussing something very, very, very interesting. And we're back with Brother Sabur firstly. Assalamu alaikum, Brother Sabur. How are you?
Good.
Good. Okay. So 2 weeks ago, we discussed something very interesting. And the title of the show was Richard Dawkins, or How Richard Dawkins Supports IRA's Narrative.
Yeah, that was an interesting
It's a spicy title, and with a lot of spicy content as well.
Annoyed a lot of people.
Yeah.
So.
Anyway, but there's a very interesting point in there that we made, which was regarding evolution. We touched upon evolution, and the point we were generally making was there are facts in science, and then there are facts in reality. And scientific facts aren't necessarily absolute facts, right? Yeah. And we mentioned this, and we clarified this, that when we say something's a scientific fact, what we're saying is that it's not necessarily absolutely true, because science, the method itself, is based on things like induction. And induction in itself, which is one, if you like, limiting factor of science, results to you not having absolute truth from the method itself.
Yeah, the problem of induction, the black swan problem.
Yeah, exactly. So on, which is basically that you're always limited to your observations, and then you make your conclusions based on those observations. It's always possible that there'll be future observations which basically throw over your theory.
Yeah, and the history of science is full of these paradigms.
Yeah.
You know, we've discovered it. There's nothing new to be discovered in physics, as Kelvin, the physicist, said. And then they had the quantum and the Einsteinian revolution.
Let's not get too technical. Let's keep it simple. But anyway, the point is,
you have paradigm shifts. Science changes all the time.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Now, what we're going to touch upon today is, if you like, a small niche in what we were discussing last time, and it's going to be very interesting because it's, again, regarding evolution. Now, understanding what scientific fact is and what a real fact is. Evolution, if you like, is considered to be a scientific fact, a strong scientific fact, a scientific theory, right? Which are basically, like you mentioned before, they're both synonymous terms, and they're pretty much the same thing.
In scientific discourse, they're synonymous.
Synonymous. Okay. So then now, what I want to discuss today is a very specific point, and that is there agreement amongst the experts in the field of evolution, amongst the scientific community, regarding the theory of evolution?
Okay, that's a good question. What I would say is we first need to define what we mean by evolution, because the way you define it in some ways is very scientifically sound, other ways not so. So if you mean variation in species, scientists wouldn't really disagree with that. If you mean natural selection taking place, again, most scientists wouldn't really disagree with that. They would say yes.
So majority of the cases, there will be consensus amongst the regarding.
Yeah, they'll say no. I mean, when it comes to, for example, the variation of butterflies, I mean, that's something that scientists have actually seen in the lab.
Yeah.
So they'll say, we don't have an issue.
There's
an
interesting image that you showed me earlier, or maybe we could share with the viewers.
Yes.
The scientist thinking of a butterfly, and he's saying evolution is a fact based on what he's thinking of, and then the child who's listening to this, he has a totally different concept in his mind.
Exactly. So it can actually create confusion, because the third aspect or third definition of evolution is a universal common ancestor. All of life can be explained by natural selection and mutations. And this is actually not scientifically as strong of a theory as variation or natural selection on its own.
Okay, so let me get this right. You're saying there's three aspects,
three meanings
to evolution, right. The theory of evolution, and what you're saying is the first two, as we discussed, they're fine. There's a general
scientifically
consensus.
You wouldn't find. I mean, I haven't found a scientist that disagrees with that.
But it's the third meaning which there's problems in, which is that everything on Earth has evolved via a common ancestor, and it all goes back to a single cell which it originated from, the tree of life.
So basically, the tree of life, all of that. Yeah.
Via the process of natural selection.
So sometimes when you have in school saying, look, the teacher says evolution is a fact, I've seen it in my lab, the child might think, okay, that means the tree of life is an absolute fact.
Right, for now, I'm sure the people watching, and I'm going to play the devil's advocate here, they're probably thinking, this guy with a pretty nice beard is making a bold claim, right?
Thank you very much.
He's making a bold claim. He's saying that evolutionary scientists, are disagreeing with each other. The experts in the field don't really agree with each other regarding this aspect of the theory. Have you any evidence to back that up? Are there any individuals you can cite us?
Okay, I can. And just before that, I just want to give a small caveat, which is I'm not going to quote any scientist who's a creationalist, who's an intelligent design scientist, because somebody would say, oh, you're just taking so-and-so's work and you're just citing it.
Yeah.
I'm going to mention people who are authorities in their field, and they don't have some sort of religious agenda behind what they're saying.
So, okay, just to knock off the the contention that these guys are quoting religious theist individuals who make these claims. So every person that we're gonna hear from you about is either an atheist or a naturalist.
I mean, you'll see yourself the authorities in science,
right?
And
that's the main crux.
Yeah.
The authorities in science, and they don't have any religious dogma or backing or anything like that.
So they don't have that sort of incentive.
Okay, so good.
Now, firstly, when it comes to the third meaning of evolution, which is universal common ancestor, this is something that there's always been some sort of dispute amongst academics, right? So this goes back all the way to Darwin. In the early 1990s, this was something that was being discussed a bit more frequently. Then this kept building up till, I would say, about 2008, 2009, around this time, it started then filtering, it started going a bit further. In like, I'll give you an example, like the New Scientist magazine, which is a popular magazine, it's not a scientific journal. They had a headline in 2009, Darwin was wrong. And what they were doing was they were basically explaining about the scientists that disagree with Darwinism. So I just want to read a quote here. This is from the magazine. "For a long time, the Holy Grail was to build a tree of life, says Eric Baptiste, an evolutionary biologist at the Pierre and Marie Curie University in Paris, France. A few years ago, it looked as though the Grail was within reach. But today the project lies in tatters, torn to pieces by an onslaught of negative evidence. Many biologists now argue that the tree concept is obsolete and needs to be discarded. We have no evidence at all that the tree of life is a reality." And again, within the same article, the atheist philosopher of biology, John Dupree, he says, "If there is a tree of life, it is a small structure growing out of the web of life." So you can see within this article, I know it's a magazine, but the authorities that are within that article are major authorities. They're not, nobody.
So none of these people are religious people or theists?
Yeah, they're not. They don't have a religious motivation. With John Dupree, he's an atheist, and what you'll find is as soon as you try and challenge Darwinian evolution, the first thing is, oh, you're creationist, oh, you're religious. So that's why we're very careful in this show to cite people who don't have a religious background.
Right, okay. So another question then, if that's clear, someone may have is, well, there's only a few people that disagree with the theory. Generally, there's a consensus regarding this point.
When it comes to the third meaning of evolution, I would say actually there's a lot of disagreement. And disagreement is now starting to come out of the scientific journals and is now creeping into Amazon and books, popular books that the public can access. So I just want to recommend 3 titles which I think are quite interesting. So you have Darwinian Fairy Tales by, again, the atheist philosopher Richard Stove, and he basically tackles it from a sociological point of view, that it doesn't actually make sense. Now, what Darwin got wrong, this is by, again, an atheist philosopher, James Fodor, and the cognitive scientist, Massimo Patimi Palmari.
Hopefully you got that right.
Hopefully I got that right. Then you have the biologist James Shapiro's book, Evolution, A View from the 21st Century. Again, he doesn't have a religious motivation. He actually speaks out against creationism.
Right. Okay.
So these people are people who are quite well known within their fields.
Yep.
And for someone to come in and say, oh, that's just some few fringe scientists here and there, I would say, no, actually, this is now gaining almost a critical mass.
Okay, it's very interesting. Now, there's a very interesting clip regarding this as well that you wanted to share.
I'm not so sanguine as some of my colleagues here that there's only one life form on this planet. We have a lot of different types of metabolism, different organisms. I wouldn't call you the same life form as the one we have that lives in pH 12 base that would dissolve your skin if we dropped you in it.
Oh, I've got the same genetic code. We'll have a common ancestor.
Well, you don't have the same genetic code. In fact, the mycoplasmas use a different genetic code and would not work in your cells. So there are a lot of variations on the
But you're not saying it belongs to a different tree of life from me, are you?
Well, I think the tree of life is an artifact of some early scientific studies that aren't really holding up. So the tree there may be a bush of life.
Right. All right. Yes.
Bush.
I don't like that word.
Richard, but that's only in
All right. I concede that point. Yeah.
So there is not a tree of life, and in fact,
You, in fact, had a comment you wanted to make, Richard, I think.
Well, it's rather moved on. I mean, I was just going to say I can't imagine why anyone should think it was an ethical problem. I could see why they might think it was a problem of expediency. You might fear that it would, escape and overrun the world or something. But ethical problem, I can't see.
Well,
but I'm now intrigued by Craig saying that he. I'm intrigued at Craig saying that the tree of life is a fiction. I mean, the DNA code of all creatures that have ever been looked at is all but identical, and surely that means that they're all related, doesn't it?
So that was very, very interesting. You had a panel discussion. I believe that was Richard Dawkins. You had obviously Krauss there, which wasn't doing much in this clip. Nevertheless, you had Richard Dawkins. You had
Dr. Craig Venter.
Dr. Craig Venter. Now he had some very interesting points that he's just made.
I mean, he's speaking about the web of life, and what's quite interesting is somebody can come in again and say, "Oh, he's just a creationist." Yeah. Actually, he's not. He is an anti-theist. He is irreligious. He's an atheist. He believes he can create a life in a lab. And, so again, he doesn't have a religious motivation to disagree with the tree of life. Yeah. But what's interesting is Dawkins is out of touch.
Yeah, he seemed like in the clip, because he seems to be trying to tell Dr. Venter, he's like, "Oh, I thought it was this. Isn't this true?" It's almost like he's trying to get acknowledgement from him.
It's quite interesting because even recently, just about 2-3 years ago, the evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson and Richard Dawkins, they had a disagreement on kin selection. Now, they were going back and forth on Twitter and, on Prospect magazine. Richard Dawkins was writing a review of his book, The Social Conquest of Earth, and they were just going back and forth. And then E.O. Wilson came on BBC Newsnight, and he said something quite interesting. He said, "Look, there's no disagreement between me and Richard Dawkins, because I'm a scientist and he's a journalist."
I know you've had quite a big history with Richard Dawkins and a different view of the natural selection process. Where are we on that now, in your view?
There is no dispute between me and Richard Dawkins, and never has been, because he's a journalist. And journalists are people who report what the scientists have found. And the arguments I've had have actually been with scientists doing research.
Yeah. And Richard Dawkins found that quite offensive, but he is sort of right, because Richard Dawkins for the last 20 years, he's been writing science books, speaking about theology, speaking about philosophy, not well, as we know. And so he's been sort of out of touch with what's actually been happening in evolutionary biology. And interestingly, the person who most people regard as an authority in evolutionary biology isn't really respected by people within the field.
Right, okay, so I think that sums up the core points there. I'm just keep thinking about Richard Dawkins, and it's almost like a little puppy looking over and saying, "Oh, is this right? Am I still correct?" Like 20 years later. But nevertheless, I think the points are made very clear. That there is disagreement amongst the experts. All the sources you quoted were all non-religious, non-theist.
Many atheists, many anti-theists.
Experts in the field.
Yeah.
So I think this is very good, because I don't think this has been mentioned before or pointed out that, it's been presented as this, and that's what I'm going to ask you now. But in actual fact, what's happening behind closed doors is that there's a lot of hair being pulled and, screaming going on and all these things. Understanding this, last question before we wrap it up. Why do we find that the theory of, or at least Darwinian evolution, is still being presented to the public, the mainstream, as, if you like, a fact, a scientific fact? Textbooks, school textbooks, and so on and so forth. If this is the reality, this is what's going on.
We need to take two things into consideration. One is history. Whenever a prevailing theory, a paradigm, it goes through a period of normal science, so it's being accepted by everyone, and it's termed a fact. Now, when academics realize, actually, no, we have to change this now, there's a slow process between when the academics change their minds and when the school children, little Timmy, sees actually it's a web of life, it's not a tree of life.
Right.
So there's that transition which takes a bit of time. But also there's something interesting James Chappell says in his book, A View from the 21st Century. Given the status of biological evolution, we can anticipate that a paradigm shift in our understanding of the subject will have repercussions far outside the life sciences. So you see, Imran, it's not just historically it takes a long time for a paradigm shift to trickle down to the layman. There's a lot more at stake if Darwinian evolution is not true.
Wow, and I'm sure that lot more at stake we can discuss in future episodes. But anyway, Jazakallah khair for coming on. Thank you. And Jazakallah khair, brothers, sisters, friends, for watching. And we hope to see you next time. Assalamu alaikum.